You may not care about your data, but these countries do. At the end of the day, these tech companies are absolutely willing to trade your privacy and surveil you for governments as a form of political capital.
So you wrote this book that points to the roots of today's biggest cyber attacks.
I go back in time, we're talking like BCE China, to give a real sense of the foundations that have led to China, Russia, and the United States and why they make the decisions they make for cyber attacks today.
Caroline, I think you've written the book on AI security, and it is quite relevant to the whole cyber warfare.
One of the things that changed entirely from beginning to end in 2025 is the phishing campaigns and phishing training. Because with all the LLMs that are incredibly good at natural language, social engineering is completely different than it ever was.
What's the scariest thing that you learned while you were doing the research that people don't talk about enough?
There's so much happening and so much enabled by Western companies that is terrible and is just human rights violations left and right.
From an AI security standpoint, do you think there is enough work being done right now?
Today, organizations are day by day trying to figure out what sorts of AI technologies are they going to consider to be of an appropriate risk profile. And so there is this real push and pull.
I want to ask both of you, give me a story from the book that made you go, I just can't believe that this actually happened.
It's such a great question, and it's so difficult to choose because
well, Allie, thank you so much for doing this. I'm going to straight up jump into one of the things that I personally am interested in. So you wrote this book that points to the roots of today's biggest cyber attacks, trace back to Imperial China and Tsarist Russia. That sounds like a thriller plot to me. Just set the scene for us. What is it?
yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I do. I go back in time. We're talking like BCE China to give a real sense of the foundations that have led to China, Russia, and the United States and why they make the decisions they make for cyber attacks today, both from a defensive and an offensive perspective. So I'm taking a look at some of the extremely dry laws that have come into place, but actually making them interesting. One of the things that was really important to me throughout this process was to add a little bit of spice and some of these conversations that are actually so interesting into it to make it more exciting. I will say that one of the things, so in every chapter I go into some historical references that tie it all together. But what I tried to do is I actually bookend the book with two wars. So at the very start of the book, I go into the Gulf War, and I talk a lot about the Gulf War, of course, not from a cyber attack perspective, because it was a little bit before that time where we were starting to see cyber attacks being used effectively in a combat scenario, but as an example of how different nations started to recognize the power of joint military operations. Because if you think about it, that was the first real powerful demonstration of joint military operations from the United States. It was a lot of learnings from the Vietnam War, from the Yom Kippur War that they put into place during the Gulf War and showed just how powerful these multi-domain warfare situations could be when orchestrated well. Now, for Russia, it was a real validation of the existing strategy they had with radio electronic combat that they had been using for a while very successfully. But for China, it was a huge wake-up call to the power of multi-domain warfare and everything that you could do if you had that type of coordination in place. And it really kicked off a huge change from a military standpoint. And so it's very important to me to start out with that war as the perspective. And then at the very end of the book, I close it out by talking about Russia's war in Ukraine, because that, to me, is the true example of how cyber attacks have now become so integrated into combat, into warfare, and how it's being done very well, how there are some things that still need to be experimented with and are changing, but seeing that shift that has taken place and the fact that true coordination is the thing that has been consistently the most powerful aspect of effective multi-domain warfare was really cool to me, and I really enjoyed it. So I do go back with very historical references, but also try to pull it into some of the more modern day references that put it into real context as to why now, as opposed to like 100 years from now.
Wow, that was a fantastic start. And I think I'm sure the audience is already intrigued. For those who don't know you, Ali, how has your background enabled to write about cyber warfare? I think today's episode, we're going to cover the real stories behind cyber warfare. So why don't you do a quick intro? I think that would be really helpful.
Absolutely, yeah. So I am an industry analyst and soon to be published author, which is exciting to be able to say. I know, right? Caroline knows exactly that feeling. Um, but I actually got my start in cybersecurity back in college. I got my degree in computer engineering and then pretty much immediately became a hacker. And I was a hacker for a number of years before becoming a security practitioner. So I've seen the cybersecurity industry from a lot of different angles, which has really helped me throughout this process. I also have done some work on election security with several three-letter agencies in order to prepare for some of the elections that we've had, and then also worked with them on other things as well. And so I've seen a couple of different angles of this that have really helped me kind of reach some of the conclusions that I did in this book. In addition to that, I interviewed a ton of people that were so fascinating to hear their perspective on, because I really wanted to take it from the standpoint of, okay, let's talk to the people who are like the people in the industry that know their stuff. Let's also talk to some people who I couldn't even mention in the book because of some security reasons, and then everyone in between. I want to talk to people who are in the military and people who have a unique perspective because of the threat research that they've done. I think it's one of the things that, to be honest, it can make it some of the most difficult stuff to do, because as I was looking through this, like, we all know from the standpoint of attribution, it's very difficult to get reliable information on, for example, how the United States uses cyber attacks, because the people researching that are typically the ones that are maybe in China or Russia. And it's much more difficult to trust the output of those, and that it hasn't been in some way adjusted or altered by the governments of those countries. And so it was a really interesting ride of like, how do I make sure that I get the most accurate information, but also go deep enough that I'm not just giving surface level information about the US, for example, as a threat actor, because it is one, and we need to think about it and talk about it that way.
Wow, great. That sounds really nice. Thank you so much for giving us your time today, Ali. And I think I would also want to bring up like another relevant topic here, which is why we have Caroline on the podcast today. And this is my first time doing a joint podcast. So like this is exciting. I've got like two accomplished writers here and two solid women. So thank you, both of you, for spending the time. But Caroline, I think you've written the book on AI security, and it is quite relevant to the whole cyber warfare, I would say, effect, right, that's out there. I would love for you to give us a little bit of an intro on like what that is. And also, maybe if you could tell us about your background so the audience knows you better.
Yeah, absolutely. Caroline Wong, 20 years in cybersecurity. About 2/3 of the time I've spent on the solution provider side, about a third of the time on the in-house security team side. When I was writing the book, I was the chief of staff for the CISO over at Teradata. And so it was fun because on a day-to-day basis, I was getting to look at brand new AI technologies built to help cybersecurity defenders. And I was also doing a lot of research and then learning about, okay, how is AI changing the game entirely for attackers? You know, one of the things that changed entirely from beginning to end in 2025 is the way that we do phishing campaigns and phishing training. Because now, with all the LLMs that are incredibly good at natural language, social engineering is completely different than it ever was. You know, I feel like social engineering in the 90s, you could say, okay, look out for bad grammar, you know, hover your mouse over this link and let us teach you about clues that will show you how to determine if something is a fraudulent message, you know. But today, the messages are smooth. They are crisp and clear, and they are perfection. And so now, actually, what we need to be teaching people is pay attention to what's going on inside of you emotionally. If you feel a sense of urgency, that's actually the giveaway. And so it's just been so incredibly exciting. I love that Allie and I get to be on this podcast together because, she's kind of taking a look at the past and asking questions like, how did what happened get us to where we are today? And when I started writing the book on AI cybersecurity, I thought to myself, by the time this comes out in March of 2026, some pieces of it are going to be out of date because it's actually moving so quickly. And here we are. And indeed, a lot of my book focuses on LLMs, generative AI. And today, agentic AI is sort of all the rage. And so it's just absolutely fascinating to see what a breakneck speed the industry is moving in response.
Yeah, I'm so excited that we're able to do this together because it's so funny. I actually had heard about Caroline a number of times from the publisher, Wiley, that we both work with. Jim was like, you need to meet Caroline. You're both going to RSA. It's going to be so great. And so I'm so glad we're able to do this together because it is no small effort to write a book. And so it's nice to talk to someone who is also in the same trenches as me.
Allie, I wonder if you would share with us for our audience today, like, what were some of your techniques that you used as you were writing? What were some of the challenges that you came across, and how did you kind of power through?
For me, I'd love to hear how you did it too, because I'm always looking for new ideas and new methods, because to be honest, I did not do it well. Like, this was one of the biggest things for me is I just, time management is so important and so difficult to do when writing a book because for my full-time job, I write reports that are a couple pages long all the time. I write blogs all the time. Writing a book is not like that. And I think I almost thought going into it, I'll just write a bunch of blogs, a bunch of reports and tie them all together. But it doesn't actually work like that at all. You have to have that central message throughout these hundreds of pages that is really like, I can't tell you the number of times that I reorganized different sections of the book into like, I think I actually want to talk about it from this format instead of this way. It's so complex. So, I mean, if I was to think about this through the lens of what would I do better next time, it would be all about time management. I remember when I first started, I was talking to another recently published author, and his advice was, go into a cabin in the woods somewhere and just spend a month there and don't do anything else but the book. And I was like, I don't need to do that. I'll be fine. Should have done it. But how about you? What are your techniques?
That is incredible. I wrote a book in 2011 and my life was so different at that point in time. I was single. I didn't have kiddos yet. I was just in a different season of my life. And when I wrote that book, it was like I just worked on it every evening and every weekend. And I had that luxury of time, actually, and then in this season of my life, I do not have that luxury. And I actually, while I wish I could have, stayed in a cabin in the woods for a month, I did kind of like the mini modern version of that, which was on some weekends, I would literally book an Airbnb for 2 nights and I would just go. Because at home, there's always so much to do. Sometimes I would bring my daughter with me so that she could kind of see like, what's mom's writing process? And, I want to like show her this part of like who I am and the work that I do. But I couldn't agree more. It is about time management. And it's also, I think, I really, really had to let go of any sort of perfectionism tendencies that I have because there's just no time for that. It will never be the perfect version that you envision in your mind. Like that is a fantasy, but what is real is what's going to add real impact and value to the world. And I must have changed the table of contents and the orders of the chapters like 3 or 4 times as I was going through, because when you're doing it, you learn about how you want to structure it. And then, like you said, it actually impacts the whole thing from beginning to end. And then you have to refactor. And it's just, I'm just so proud of us, Allie.
Yeah, I know, right? I can't imagine doing it with children. Like that's, but to your point, like I was talking to a friend when I was like maybe 6 months into it. And I was like, as I'm writing, so anxious because I want this to be perfect. And she was like, it's not going to be perfect. Like, you just have to accept that. That's just the reality. And I was like, oh, right. It's not going to be perfect. And it did help. It did help. You do have to just accept it.
I'm just feeling quite a bit of FOMO out here. I think I should also write like a
You
book.
most definitely should. There's no question about it. And you have two very good book writing mentors at the Sam Wilson.
Yeah, I think I'm going to use this podcast as like my base to learn about the strategies. But thank you guys. I think this is like really, really interesting. So now I want to like ask both of you, give me a story from the book that made you go, wow, I just can't believe that this actually happened, because people on the cyber warfare would be really interested in learning about that, something interesting that will pique everyone's attention. And also, Caroline, from your point of view, something that is actually changing the world of security from an AI standpoint, right? So, Ali, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked this question, because one thing that was really important to me is that throughout the book, I really try to focus on human stories. There's a lot of like really interesting technical details that we could get into, but I wanted this book to be something that anyone could read, and the human stories are what everyone can really connect to in this. So one example is an attack that, to be honest, everyone knows. Like, it's not going to be a surprise to anyone that I'm bringing up this attack, but not everyone knows this like little story within it. And that's where I found things to be so interesting. So the attack itself is NotPetya. Like, we all know about NotPetya. That's not something new for anyone. But the kind of brief recap and then the cool stuff is, the brief version of the story is really about like, it's the day before Ukrainian Constitution Day, and a Ukrainian tax preparation software is compromised. It spreads a wiper malware. At the time, it was disguised as ransomware. People thought it was ransomware. It was actually just wiping systems. It didn't hit Russia. That was the one place that it didn't hit. But it was developed to target Ukraine, and later on, people would learn that it was by Russia. It was ultimately just to try and humiliate Ukraine on its Constitution Day. And at the end of the day, it caused a lot of damage, right? It took down a third of Ukraine's economy for 3 days. It actually ended up spreading out of control and affected companies and countries globally. One of those was Maersk. It actually took down all 150 of Maersk's domain controllers, which is just a nightmare for any company. Domain controllers manage user authentication and administration. If you lose them, you are in a world of hurt, and it means you lose access to all your employee accounts. They got extremely lucky because a singular domain controller survived this. And the way that they survived this was, the domain controller was in Ghana. And Ghana had gone through a blackout, which is very common in sub-Saharan Africa. They go through these types of blackouts all the time. It makes it very difficult to operate with technology, to be honest. But that's normally a very frustrating thing. It was the one thing that saved Maersk. They didn't boot the system back up. The people that were in HQ, I think in London, were like, please do not turn on that system, whatever you do, even when you get power back. And they actually ended up getting the server and bringing it on a plane to Nigeria, because the guy in Ghana didn't have a visa to get into England, and then passing it off to another employee who literally carried it to England so that they could back up from that server, because they actually didn't have the bandwidth to back up from that server in Ghana. So just an incredible story that is so interesting to me, because it really shows that like not everything is a technology problem. Sometimes these little human nuances, like very common blackouts in sub-Saharan Africa, can be the things that actually end up saving companies in very serious cyber attacks and cyber situations. And then on top of that, sometimes you gotta just like get on a plane with the technology and make sure that you can get it back to whatever country you need to do a backup. So I really love these little nuances within these very well-known stories that show the real human side of things. And so even though the story and like the overall attack wasn't exciting for me to learn about that piece of it, I just loved recounting in the book.
I have to say, Allie, what an extraordinary story. And at the end of the day, there's nothing like a human getting onto an airplane to get some really important work done. I think a lot of what I spent time when I was writing the book is actually envisioning, what is the future going to look like 2, 5, 10 years from now? You know, I think about security leaders. They have to manage dozens of different technologies. In just a couple of years, it's going to be legacy technologies either replaced by AI technologies or working side by side with AI technologies. And what that's going to mean is just more dashboards, more alerts, more work to do. And I think that, unfortunately, we've also observed in the last couple of years, a lot of CISOs are seeing budget cuts. Some security teams are seeing layoffs. And so there's this fascinating thing going on where AI is actually changing the work that needs to be done. And so I talk a lot about not only how can defenders prepare themselves and use AI to kind of be on our side, if you will. But it's a fascinating problem. And Allie, like you said, it's not all technical problems. It's not all how do we do identity management with AI? How do we do data leakage prevention with AI? Sometimes it's how do we coordinate between different humans when there is so much AI in the mix? How do we ensure that there is a human in the loop at the appropriate places and we're actually using human judgment and human opinion? And that sort of separation of duties of what can we have the AI do versus what do I actually still want to do, I think is sort of endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, kind of always keeps me going back to what humans need to enable themselves with, essentially, going forward. And I think just stretching on that thread of human element, right, Ali, I think a question that I would have for you is, what's the scariest thing that you learned while you were doing the research that people don't talk about enough?
Oh, God. That's an interesting question. First off, I do want to say, Caroline, I applaud you for being able to identify what's coming next with AI, because every time someone talks to me about it, I'm like, who knows? So the fact that you put that in writing is very impressive and must have taken a lot of work and a lot of thinking to do. I'd say the scariest parts of this to me, unfortunately, within Code War, one of the things that I tried to do is I really tried to balance the just depressing parts of the book with the hopeful ones. Because, I mean, let's be real here. Half of the book is talking about the defensive side. And what the defensive side really is it's the ways that these countries control their populace. It's the ways that these countries send propaganda into their populace, censor their populace, make sure that they can surveil their populace. And so there's a lot of the book, and a lot that I cut out, to be honest, or tried to kind of make sure I consolidated in a way that respected the challenges that they face, that just goes into the surveillance methods that technology has enabled and the attacks that these countries are perpetrating against their own people to meet certain ends. And so I'd say that that's the thing that gets me the most throughout this is there's so much happening and so much enabled by Western companies that is terrible and is just human rights violations left and right. And of course, one of the key points that I talk about throughout the book is these things have been happening forever. This is not a new thing because of the cyber attacks we can use, the cyber defensives we can put in place, but we can do it at scale in a way we just couldn't before. A good example of this is actually in China, where throughout the years, they've used a lot of social surveillance and social control to manage the populace throughout time, right? They're able to do that much more effectively now. And one of the ways that they do that is they use the companies that are providing the internet services, and they put regulations around those companies. And the regulations can be pretty broad. They can be things like, oh, make sure that you're not allowing people to post about things that could be construed as potential terrorist activity. And that is so broad that they could mean something as simple as saying oh, China shouldn't have control of Hong Kong. That's one that comes up time and time again. If you try to say that in Hong Kong or in China, you are probably going to get arrested, or something is going to happen to you to try and scare you away from that type of activity. And so they end up putting in this system of self-censorship for the people and for the companies that are operating it, and that's how they're able to scale that apparatus effectively. It is very, throughout the process of writing the book, it was very taxing to go through those examples because they can just carry so much weight. But it's important because one of the things that I think is so crucial about this is like, this is the human connection to cybersecurity. This is where cybersecurity and the actual impacts in the real world meet, which was what I really wanted to get through with this book beyond the kind of like multiple domains of warfare and how you coordinate all of that is like, what are the actual human impacts of cyber attacks and cyber defenses that we don't see or communicate well enough about? Because that's what this is all about at the end of the day. Without a real world action, without a real world consequence, there's no point in doing a cyber attack. There just isn't. And that's one of the things that we can use to better understand why those cyber attacks happen and how we can address them better and how we can prepare better. And so I think it came through with some of these examples, but those were some of the most difficult to write about and also taxing to think about as we like look at what the future is going to look like.
I mean, like that is quite interesting when it comes to just relating it back to the actual impact and from the human element, right? I think the one more question I have, Ali, there is like with the changing landscape of the current, I would say, tech industry or the growth of technology in itself, right? I would say, how do you see the value of your book or your research in terms of cyber warfare aligned with how humans need to perceive it and learn from it and essentially put more time into it as well?
One of the reasons that I wrote this book for general populace, like anybody interested in geopolitics, anyone interested in tech or business is able to read this book. The reason that I did that is because I think that we in cybersecurity get it. We get why privacy is important. But when I talk to my friends, when I talk to anyone outside of cybersecurity, it's always, oh, well, China doesn't care about my data. The US doesn't care about my data. So it doesn't really matter. That couldn't be further from the truth. Like the thing for me about this is that if users don't participate, for all the bluster of like these countries and these companies, if the users do not participate, they have nothing. All of this goes away. The only reason this exists is because we participate and because we choose to participate. And there's power in that I think we need to bring to light a little bit more. And one of the ways that we do that is by communicating that, like, you may not care about your data, but these countries do. They want your data. They want to change your opinion about things. These companies do as well. And that's where the true power lies. And so if you make little decisions, like I'm talking have strong passwords and use multi-factor authentication, you can have real impact on the way that these countries are able to operate when it comes to taking your data. These companies operate when it comes to the ways that they're able to surveil you or use your information. And to be honest, I think now is the most important time to be having that conversation for cybersecurity professionals with the broader public. Because at the end of the day, what we're seeing is these tech companies are absolutely willing to trade your privacy and willing to surveil you for governments as a form of political capital. And so the further we descend into that kind of world, the more we need users to understand their true power in this scenario and what they need to do to get there and how easy it can be. That it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to understand the ins and outs of cyber attacks to do this well.
Mm-hmm. Give me one of those connections, Allie. Like a normal audience would not really be aware of, right? Like apart from the security professionals, probably. Just the general population, right? Like, hey, this is what is happening with my data. That, oh my god, like I didn't even know about this. Or probably these are some of the facets of the data that I share with a particular company, and this is sort of the surveillance that was happening on top of it. Like just a normal, like example of one of these scenarios that people are completely unaware of, and that we see just in like broad daylight happening.
The most common ones that I think about a lot are, of course, like in China especially, they have so much control over the services and the internet activity that's happening that they're able to see all of the messages that people are sending. They're able to censor those messages in real time. And that's all because they have this control over the companies and this tight integration between the government and the companies themselves, especially the tech sector, right? And so when I think about that, I think about it in the context of everything that's happening politically in the world. And one of the things that we're seeing is that, especially like in the United States as an example, we see the tech companies especially getting way closer to the government than they ever have been and allowing things that 5 or 10 years ago they never would, or they at least certainly publicly never would. That is the type of thing that concerns me because most people think, oh, who cares if Meta is reading all of my messages if WhatsApp isn't actually using the encryption that they claim that they're using because nobody really cares about my data. And the reality is all you have to do is look at China to know that they do. And that if they can have that control at scale, they will use it. Now, the thing that I think not enough people are thinking about in the context of cyber attacks and how they play in a broader geopolitical sense is if you look at the Digital Silk Road initiative that China has implemented over the past several decades. They have helped and created surveillance equipment for countries all over the world. And they've helped install it. They've helped manage it. They've created some of the hardware that is set up to actually do things that are as critical as communications infrastructure. And that type of control, given the direction that China has moved with tightening a lot of its partnership with the companies that it works with in the tech sector specifically, means that that is ultimately control that China has. And so anytime you are using Huawei as an example for your communications infrastructure, you really should be assuming that the Chinese government is listening on that because there's no separation there between what the government is able to do and what they're able to dictate that some of these companies do. It's just the reality that we're operating under. And so I think that that gets missed in this broader conversation, whereas like if you look at the Brick and Road initiative, like very useful initiative for a lot of countries, especially in developing nations, but it comes with its own risks, particularly with the countries that are interacting most closely with China and with some of these nations. So there's a lot of angles to this that are concerning, but as I think about the values that are spreading most frequently and most far within the world, these are my main concerns around what it means for the individual and for protecting individual rights.
Yeah, it's really interesting that even if some of these concepts are not really well understood by the general population, right, they're affected by it. And it's time for everyone to at least read a bit more and be aware of the values that we need to follow from an enterprise standpoint to begin with. But again, percolating a little bit of that to general population as well, because we all are affected in the end. And the recent example of that is what we saw was OpenClaw, right? Like how the whole OpenClaw story kind of unfolded. If you don't know how to do it right, it's like giving scissors to teenagers in a room, and it's like, what will they do in the end?
Yes.
So we saw some of that, which is quite interesting. I'm really intrigued, Allie. I will definitely like be ordering your book for sure, and going through some of the stories that you mentioned. So, Calvin, what do you think about like this human element from an AI security standpoint? Like, do you think there is enough work being done right now at the same speed at which it is coming at us? And if there's any parallels that you can draw from it?
There is an absolutely terrifying intersection between Allie's work and my work. And this has everything to do with supply chain, particularly when it comes to AI, LLMs. Where did this data come from? What's the provenance of this model? What data is being used to train this model? Like, this is changing third-party security risk management in totally nuts ways. Like, when I try and explain kind of this concept to folks that aren't in tech, aren't in cybersecurity, I'll say to them, look, you send your kid to a daycare What if some of the kids at the daycare are allergic to peanuts? You want to make sure that any and all of the food that's brought into that daycare doesn't have peanuts in it. And today, organizations are day by day trying to figure out what sorts of AI technologies are they going to consider to be of an appropriate risk profile to go ahead and just put in their environments, connect to everything. Folks understand that AI is more powerful the more context you give it. And so there is this real push and pull that is just going to be so fascinating to see how it unravels.
Agreed, 100%. And I think that is some of the work that we do at Xari, right? Where security is like really, really the foundational concept as to be building the products that affect, like whether it is enterprises or general audience that we talked about. Great. That was awesome. I think we covered a lot of interesting elements there, and I'm sure people are going to be like thrilled to go through your books. But just to maybe close on a note where people will be even more intrigued to go through it. Why should someone who's never thought about cybersecurity pick up your book? And I want both of you guys to answer this question.
The way that I see it, each and every person, each and every human is affected by cybersecurity. Our lives are inundated with technology, and we don't always think about, am I vulnerable? Am I at risk? But the actual reality is we engage in different online activities every day throughout the day that do put us at risk. And AI is changing that entirely. And I do think that sometimes change can be scary for people, but I think one of the most empowering things that we can do is to learn. Because what happens is those who learn become those with the power. And so I'm just delighted that folks are able to access the deep research that Allie and I have done in very, very different areas and very, very different timeframes, but we're going to be able to teach people. And that to me is incredibly satisfying.
Yeah, for me, the reality is what the most recent wars that we've seen have taught us is that cyber attacks are now a fundamental part of warfare. They're a fundamentally important part of warfare. They're a part of geopolitics. They are integrated into all of this. And so if you are interested in how the world is going to change in the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, you need to have fundamentals on what is important in cybersecurity and what isn't, because there's a lot of confusion out there. One of the reasons I wanted to write this book is because I see a lot of articles that come up like, is cyber war next? What's going to happen? And they lack a fundamental understanding of where cyber attacks are the most powerful and why. And that's the gap that's being filled with, I hope, with this book, is actually taking a look at where cyber attacks make the most sense in geopolitical and wartime scenarios and putting that into context that is easy for anyone to understand.
I love that. So what you're saying is that when people keep saying that cyber war is coming, but that's not true, it's already here, and that's not how people think about it. And that's why we need to prep for it from the angle of understanding what it looks like, and also how do we prep for it using the modern technologies like AI security and stuff like that. If I hear that correctly, from the same perspective.
Yeah, I think my thing is cyber war doesn't exist. Cyber war isn't a thing. It is a facet of war. That is the reality, is a facet of geopolitics. And trying to separate it out is meaningless because, like I said earlier, at the end of the day, a cyber attack doesn't happen unless there's a real world reason for it to happen. There has to be some impact in our real world that makes that happen. And so when I think about the term cyber war, I'm like, it's just war. This is just a part of war. It's just a part of geopolitics. It's a very important part, is the thing. And if you want to understand the future, you need to understand how that is changing.
Mm-hmm. But the more and more dependency that we have on technology these days, majority of the part may be reliant on this cyber techniques. Is that so?
There's definitely a lot that is reliant on the cyber angle of this. One of the things I explore in the book actually is there are a lot of cases, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine as an example, in the war in Ukraine, where you can just use a missile. You don't need to take out the electric grid with a cyber attack when you can just bomb it and call it a day. It depends on the task that you want to accomplish and why you want to accomplish it. And that's what I love so much about this is like, that's why the coordination element is so important, is because there are critical aspects of war that require cybersecurity and cyber attacks to do well, especially for espionage and real world understanding and situational awareness of the conflict. But it's also a matter of like choosing the right tool for the right task.
Oh, okay. That's why I took a pause there.
That's
I think that
deep.
was
Wow.
that was interesting, and I'm really glad that I got to do this with you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just one last question: where do people find your book and when?
Yeah, so for me, Code War is available anywhere books are sold. It's available for pre-order right now until March 17th when it goes live. So you'll be able to pick up your copy in stores then, or please pre-order it now. It's always good to have it on the way soon.
The birth date of Allie's book is just a week before mine, so pre-orders are open. You can get it anywhere and everywhere, and they'll show up on your doorstep March 24th.
Awesome. I think we should do another of this maybe after your book has been released and like just go through some of the stories and things that you were hearing from the people. I'll be totally up for it. And I wish you guys all the best with your books. I'm sure the audience has heard like all the interesting pieces that they would want to like dig into. So thank you. Thank you for your time. And I'll be looking forward to seeing you guys at RSA.
Can't wait. Thank you.